I never imagined that comfort could turn into a kind of quiet suffocation. At 64, my days felt predictable. Mornings with tea brewed exactly at 7:10, a slow walk in the garden, reading the same novels I'd read years ago. Everything in my world remained intact, untouched, unchanging. Except me. I had changed quietly, invisibly. Richard, my husband, still occupied the same space in the house, but not in my life. We rarely spoke beyond practical exchanges. His affection had dried up long ago, replaced with polite tolerance. He didn't notice the subtle ways I tried to reach him, setting his favorite coffee down exactly how he liked it, brushing his coat sleeve when handing it over. Each attempt met with silence. Some people say silence is peaceful. I'd grown to learn it could also be devastating. One evening, feeling particularly restless, I dressed a little nicer than usual and wandered into town. There was an art exhibit opening at the local gallery. I don't know what drew me there. Perhaps boredom, maybe the hope of seeing something that would remind me I was still alive. The gallery buzzed with chatter and clinking wine glasses. I stood quietly in front of a large painting, vivid, chaotic, yet somehow grounding. I didn't hear him walk up. "You're the only one who's been looking at that for more than 10 seconds, a voice said beside me. I turned and met the eyes of a man far too young to be speaking to me that way. He had the sort of gaze that made you feel like he'd already read a few pages of your story. I suppose it's the only one that feels like it wasn't trying to impress. I said, surprised at how natural my voice sounded. "It's mine," he replied. There was no arrogance in his tone, just curiosity. I felt my skin warm, not from attraction, I told myself, but from the unexpected intimacy of being seen. We spoke for a few minutes. His name was Ethan, 27, an artist, thoughtful without being pretentious. He didn't ask my age. He didn't comment on my appearance. He asked what I thought about the painting, as if my opinion mattered. When I left, I couldn't remember the last time someone had made me feel so visible. Back at home, Richard was asleep on the couch with the television flickering in front of him. I stood in the doorway, watching him. Once, that man made me feel like I was the only person in a room full of noise. Now, he couldn't be bothered to glance up when I walked in. That night in bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept returning to Ethan's painting, then his eyes, and then the way he asked questions like he genuinely wanted to understand me. I wasn't interested in him. I told myself again. I wasn't chasing anything. I was simply stirred by something I didn't know I'd been starving for. The next morning, I found a card tucked in my coat pocket. His handwriting was careful. It read, "If you ever want to talk more about art or anything, I'll be at the retreat next weekend. No pressure, just space." My fingers trembled slightly as I held it. I stared at the ink until the letters blurred. It felt innocent enough. But deep down, I knew this was a kind of invitation that didn't just lead to conversations. It opened doors you couldn't easily close again. And yet, the hollowness of my current life made the idea of stepping through that door feel less like betrayal and more like breathing. I didn't tell Richard about the gallery. I didn't tell him about Ethan. Then again, he hadn't asked where I'd gone. Maybe he stopped wondering years ago. Maybe I had too. The card stayed on my desk for 3 days. I'd pick it up, read it again, then place it back under a stack of unread mail. The idea of going felt absurd. I was a married woman, a grandmother. What was I thinking? But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it whispered at the edges of my thoughts. I found myself rehearsing explanations, excuses. Not for Ethan. He hadn't asked for any. For myself. On Friday morning, I told Richard I'd be gone for the weekend. A book club retreat, I said, casually. He nodded, eyes on his tablet. No follow-up questions. No curiosity. I could have said I was going to Paris, and he would have said, "Text me if you need anything." The retreat was held in a quiet countryside house, more rustic than I expected. There were only a few people there. 2 other artists, both lost in their work, and Ethan, who greeted me with a soft smile. He didn't mention the note, didn't push, just welcomed me in like I was always meant to be there. We talked that first night, while others worked on their pieces. He asked about my favorite music, what colors I wore when no one was around, whether I'd ever written anything I hadn't shown anyone. His questions felt like keys unlocking drawers I'd long sealed shut. I didn't feel old when I spoke to him. I didn't feel invisible. The next day, we walked along a narrow trail behind the house. The air was crisp, and our silence felt comfortable. He spoke about how art is often born from wounds, how people mistake age for stillness, but how still water often runs deepest. I didn't respond right away. I was afraid that if I spoke, the weight of what I felt might spill out. Later, we sat by the fire as others drifted to bed. He sketched quietly while I read. At one point, I looked over and realized he was drawing me. Not my face, but my hands resting gently on my lap. When I asked why, he said, "They look like they've held entire lives." I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever described me like that before. That evening, I found myself standing by the window of my room, watching the dark wrap itself around the hills. I wasn't thinking about Richard. I wasn't even thinking about Ethan. I was thinking about who I used to be before life became so small. The woman who danced barefoot in the rain, who wrote love letters in the margins of books, who once believed that passion wasn't reserved for the young. A quiet knock at the door broke my thoughts. It was Ethan. He didn't come in. He didn't ask to. He just said, "Can't sleep either?" and leaned on the doorframe. We spoke in whispers. About nothing. About everything. I told him how it had been years since anyone really looked at me. He said, "I see you now." Not in a way that felt performative or flirtatious, but honest. There was no kiss, no touch. Just a moment, suspended. But everything changed in that stillness. I felt myself tilt, ever so slightly, towards something I hadn't felt in years. Wanted, not for youth, not for beauty, but for the quiet, steady soul I thought had gone unnoticed for too long. When he left, I stood there long after the door closed. The wind outside howled gently. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, not afraid of falling, but afraid of never knowing what it would feel like to let go. The next morning was quieter. The other guests had left early, citing weather warnings. Ethan and I were alone in the house, but neither of us mentioned it. The silence between us had shifted. It wasn't cautious anymore. It was expectant. He offered me coffee, and we sat across from each other without speaking. There was no awkwardness, just an undercurrent of something that felt inevitable. I watched him sketch in his notebook while I pretended to read. Every now and then, he'd glance up as if studying me, not in the way a man stares at a woman he wants, but like an artist trying to capture something intangible. Later, I wandered into the studio where he worked. Paints, brushes, scraps of canvas. He handed me a pencil and said, "Try." I hesitated, then started drawing lines, shaky at first, then steadier. He didn't laugh, didn't critique. He watched me with a kind of reverence that made my hands tremble. I hadn't created anything in decades. I'd forgotten how good it felt just to move your hand and leave a mark. Rain began falling, light at first, then harder. By late afternoon, thunder rolled in. We stayed inside. The house felt smaller, the air heavier. Ethan turned on a record player in the corner, something old, low, and slow. He offered his hand without saying anything. I didn't even hesitate. I took it. We danced. No talking. His hand was warm on the small of my back. I could feel his breath near my temple. Every movement said more than words ever could. It was not lust. It was not desperation. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous. When the song ended, we didn't move apart. His fingers brushed my cheek, hesitant but sure. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. When he kissed me, it wasn't urgent. It was reverent, as if he were kissing a memory he didn't want to forget. And when I kissed him back, something inside me shattered and rearranged all at once. We didn't speak while it happened. The storm outside beat against the windows, but I barely heard it. All I could feel was the weight of his body, the warmth of his breath, the disbelief that I could still be one like this. Not as a fantasy, not as a novelty, but as a woman with history, with lines, with silence in her past and noise in her heart. Later, I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, my pulse still loud in my ears. He had fallen asleep, his arm draped gently over my waist. I didn't touch him. I didn't move. I just let myself feel the stillness. It didn't feel like guilt, not yet. It felt like awakening, like opening a window after years of stale air. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid to be seen. I thought of Richard, briefly, of how he used to hold me when we were young, how he used to ask about my dreams. That man was gone now, replaced by someone who couldn't even ask how my day had been. I wondered if he would ever notice what I had done, what had changed in me. I doubted it. I got up carefully, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat by the fireplace. The flames danced quietly, like they knew something had shifted but didn't dare comment. My hands still tingled from where Ethan had touched them. I stared into fire and felt the weight of everything and nothing at once. No promises were made. No future was discussed. But something irreversible had happened, not just between him and me, but inside me. I had crossed a line, not out of recklessness, but out of a hunger I could no longer deny. By the time I returned home, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried the weight of the weekend. Richard sat in the living room, his attention fixed on a news channel. He looked up briefly when I came in, then back at the screen. "How was the book retreat?" he asked without inflection. "Fine," I replied, and he nodded as if that completed the conversation. I went upstairs and unpacked slowly. The clothes smelled like wood smoke and oil paint. I folded them with care, as though the way I treated them might change the meaning of what they'd been part of. I tucked Ethan's card into the back of a drawer, next to an old photograph of myself I hadn't looked at in years. In it, I was laughing, hair windblown, eyes alive. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Days passed. Richard didn't ask anything else. I moved to the house like I always had, but something had shifted inside me. I didn't speak more or act differently, but I noticed things I hadn't before. The way Richard avoided eye contact, the way he filled his evenings with noise, TV, phone calls, meaningless distractions. I used to feel invisible. Now I realized he'd been hiding, too. I wrote a letter to Ethan. I didn't send it. I just needed to write it. I told him thank you for seeing me, for reminding me I was still alive in ways I'd forgotten. I told him I wouldn't come back, not because I regretted it, but because I couldn't live between two truths. I folded the letter and left it inside a book I'd finished years ago, one I never planned to reread. I started waking earlier. I spent more time in the garden. I began trimming the roses myself, something I hadn't done in years. The thorns cut my fingers, but I didn't mind. The sting reminded me I was real. I read new books, cooked different meals, said no to things I used to agree out of habit. Richard noticed the changes in small ways, raised eyebrows, longer glances, but said nothing. One evening, he asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. It had been months since he'd suggested that. I said yes. We didn't talk much at the restaurant, but the gesture was enough. I didn't expect him to change. I didn't even know if I wanted him to. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had something separate from him, something untouched, something mine. I never heard from Ethan again. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to pull me back. Maybe he knew I had already taken what I needed. Maybe he had, too. What happened that weekend wasn't a love story. It wasn't about escape. It was about recognition, about looking into a mirror held up by someone else and not flinching at the reflection. There's a kind of freedom that comes not from breaking away, but from returning differently. I hadn't run from my life. I had stepped outside it, seen it from another angle, and come back knowing I didn't have to disappear within it. Now I find peace in small things. A warm mug, a trimmed rose bush, a clear morning sky. The ache is still there, but it's quieter. Less of a wound, more of a reminder. I don't regret what I did. I regret how long it took to remember that I was still a woman with desires, thoughts, stories left to live. And though I may never tell anyone about that weekend, I carry it like a hidden thread sewn into the hem of my days. Some things don't need to last to matter. Some truths are brief and blinding. And some awakenings come not to change everything, but just enough